Hello, everyone, and welcome to an introduction to rent control in New Jersey. My name is Tom Major. I am an attorney admitted to practice in New York and New Jersey, and I'm a principal and attorney with the firm Offit Kerman. And today we are going to talk about the basics of rent control in New Jersey. This is a subject that's near and dear to my heart because my practice is almost comprised entirely of real estate development and management, the acquisition, the financing, the construction, and ultimately the management of the building. And in northern New Jersey especially, rent control is a hot button topic. And so it's my pleasure today to share with you the basics of rent control, and hopefully at the end of this discussion you'll walk away with a more nuanced understanding of how rent control functions in New Jersey and how you might advise your clients should you confront a rent control issue. To begin, we're going to start with a colloquial discussion of rent control. We'll just talk in simple terms what it is, what it does, and where you might find these ordinances. Then we'll address important constitutional questions. We'll talk about New Jersey and the Home Rule, which is a creature of the New Jersey State Constitution. We'll talk about the federal constitution, the state constitution, and address the issues of takings and a phrase we're going to hear over and over again today, which is just and reasonable return. So if you're looking for one phrase to memorize when it comes to rent control and takings jurisprudence, just and reasonable return is going to be the key phrase for today. And then we'll talk about equal protection. Once we dispose of the constitutional elements, we'll go into how rents are controlled. And to do this, we will use Jersey City as an example. Jersey City, up in northern New Jersey, right across the Hudson River from Manhattan, has a fairly robust rent control ordinance, and its administration is also pretty robust. And so, although this ordinance isn't without its nuances, this is a good place to look at a bird's eye view of rent control. Then we'll talk about rent control compliance. We'll talk about rent control overcharges and the New Jersey Consumer Fraud Act. And we'll learn about how you can end up hurting for certain on game day if you are a landlord and you overcharge a tenant in a rent control jurisdiction or in a property that's subject to rent control. And then we'll take a couple of minutes at the end to put it all together. And then by the end of this presentation, you'll walk away being a lean, mean, rent control knowing machine. With that said, let's dive in. One of the things that comes up all the time is, and this happens mostly dealing with, let's say, pro se litigants or just in common parlance, is the question of whether rent control is constitutional at all. You know, you hear stories or you'll see stories in the newspapers or online about tenants who are getting massive buyouts from rent-controlled jurisdictions, or you'll hear stories of somebody lives in an apartment for 30 years and their rent is $400, or they live in a 5-bedroom, 3-bedroom apartment and their rent is $200 and they inherited it from their great-great-grandmother. You know, and these kinds of outlier examples tend to drive people's opinion about rent control. People hear these things and they think there's no way this is constitutional. How could this be? Well, that's not the only reason why one might question the constitutionality of rent control. The purpose of rent control, essentially by definition, is to affect the return a property owner will realize. By limiting the property owner's rent increases, or the amount of rent that can be set, and excluding certain charges, rent control ordinances limit the ability of a landlord to do what they see fit with a property. And they insulate tenants from market conditions. Now, there are many schools of thought about whether this is an effective thing to do for maintaining and growing a housing supply, but we're not going to talk about that today. Today, we're going to talk mostly about acknowledging that rent control exists and how we can function in a universe where rent control is a reality. So when you consider that rent control by its stated purpose is going to limit a landlord's return, and sometimes dramatically so, the question becomes, is this unconstitutional? Why would a law allow potentially 564 unique rent control ordinances? There are over 500 municipalities in New Jersey, and under the state constitution, conceivably each one could have its own unique rent control ordinance. Worse, an unconstitutional ordinance could operate as a taking, or it could violate due process by treating landlords differently. These are the big ticket items that we'll discuss first and are the primary constitutional considerations in evaluating a rent control ordinance. First, though, let's talk about how we get here. New Jersey, as a principle, follows the home rule. Now, under the home rule, or the home rule principle, the police power of a state can be invested or delegated to local governments that, to enable that local government to discharge its role as an arm or agency of the state to meet the needs of the community.